Welcome to Project Chatter, the podcast where PPM experts from various sectors talk about the latest trends. Listen to Val and Dale as they talk about tried and tested best practices and share their unfiltered thoughts about the industry. Whether you're here to learn how to progress your career, improve your project control skills, or just want to hear an Aussie and South African rant about projects, then you've come to the right place. Welcome to the Project Chatter podcast with your hosts, Dale Fung and Val Matthews.
This podcast is brought to you by Plan Academy. Plan Academy is the world's leading learning site for anyone working in construction project management or project controls.
At Plan Academy, you learn construction planning and scheduling theory, how to master scheduling software like Primavera P6, and even advanced construction scheduling techniques.
Plan Academy's courses are 100% online and at your own pace. You can learn at the office, at site, from home, anywhere. Check out planacademy.com today for free sample lessons and tons of free video.
Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by justdo.com. JustDo is a great business and project management tool we've been using here at Project Chatter.
I agree, Val. I like to keep things simple, and JustDo is perfect for that. But I do know it's got a lot of powerful functionality as well. And one of my favorites is the task-specific chat.
Absolutely. And for all you slackers, don't wait for Monday. Check out justdo.com. Now on with the pod. Hello everyone, and welcome to Project Chatter podcast. I'm Val Matthews, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Dale Fung.
Hello, folks.
In this episode, we get to talk to Glenn Hyde, who is the Director of GMH Planning, which is a consultancy that specializes in NEC engineering and construction contracts. Hey Glenn, how you going?
Yeah, good, thanks. Thank you for inviting me in today.
Mate, we had the pleasure of having you on our podcast today to talk about NEC, and we look forward to it. Before we go into NEC, however, and the types of NEC contracts, and obviously pick Glenn's brain on some of the nuances of NEC, here's Dale with Glenn's bio.
Cheers, Val. Thanks very much. So a lot of people know Glenn that have been trained in the UK, but here's a quick bio. So Glenn Hyde is the director of GMH Planning, which is a consultancy that specializes in NEC forms of contract. Glenn focuses on providing NEC training, consultancy, and resources to the construction industry. Glenn has presented on aspects of the contract at various national conferences and has published a number of articles for the ICE Procurement, Management and Law publication and the NEC User Group newsletter. Glenn provides training to most of the large client and contractor organizations in the UK construction industry. Having exclusively used the NEC form of contracts for the past 20 years, he offers insight and practical advice on how users within the industry should understand and maximize the effectiveness of the contract on their projects or businesses. He's the founder of NEC People LinkedIn Group, which is the largest and most successful discussion forum around NEC contracts. And he also manages Reachback, the largest Q&A portal where users can ask NEC-related questions. Glenn is also a lead developer of FastDraft, which is a new cloud-based portal for comprehensively managing the flow of NEC communications on projects, ensuring all parties are following the correct processes and timescales. So, wow, Glenn, could we call you Mr. NEC?
Glenn's fine, honestly.
No, as Val says, it's amazing, and thank you very much for spending the time chatting to us on this pod. I guess if we start just at the top, 20 years is a long time. So obviously NEC is, it's kept you interested long enough. What's your sort of origin story as you started off and where you are today?
Yeah, it's not quite, I've ended up not quite where I envisaged I would. So literally now I'm training 5 days a week for all aspects of managing the contract. And I never envisaged being a teacher, trainer. Did my civil engineering degree, went in, joined Burst Construction as they were then, as a setting out engineer, and worked sort of through being a set out engineer, site engineer, senior engineer, sub-agent. And then I was looking to be a sort of project manager. And within the contraction organisation, they said, we'll go into planning, do 3 months there, because you'll then come out a better project manager. I went into planning and thought, actually, this is a lot easier than project managing, so I'm going to stay here. And then became a planning manager. So rather than all the problems you have with a project manager, managing subcontractors, clients, health and safety, it seemed slightly an easier gig just to focus on the construction program. So just sort of focused that as my niche and became a planning manager for that same main contractor, had a team of planners supporting them. making sure that they're following, obviously, the contractual rules, practical rules. And I was quite lucky in a way, I guess, that happened that the type of work the bursts were doing was all NEC forms of contract. So from sort of 2000, maybe even slightly earlier. So really got into this just being a user of these contracts. And I went along to one of the NEC conferences in 2006. And whilst it was a very good conference, they did these breakout groups in the afternoon. And one of the consultants, who's still around now, was giving advice to the room and saying you should show the worst case effects of early warnings on a program. And I stuck my hand up and said, I don't think that's quite right, that you shouldn't show worst case, and questionable what you should show with early warnings at all. And he said, well, that's what I think. And another planning manager who I knew from another company stuck his hand up and said, yeah, I'm with Glenn. I don't think that's very good advice. And there was a little bit of debate in the room, and then it kind of moved on. And I reported back to the NEC and said, good conference, but I don't think the advice that you were giving, a selection of that group, was very good or very strong. And they said, well, we do user group sessions and we invite people from the industry, so why don't you come and do a session from the contractor's viewpoint? And I said, okay. So did a session in Manchester and London for them in early 2006. And later that year, they were looking for a part-time trainer and said, look, you showed quite good knowledge of the contract. Would you consider coming to do training with us part-time? So I went to see my boss at the contracting organisation, and he said, well, I don't want to lose you altogether. So if it means I can have you 3 days a week, I will. So that was when I set up GMH Planning. So 2006, set up my consultancy and had pretty much 1 or 2 days guaranteed training with the NEC, the authors of the contract, and then guaranteed 3 or 4 days work with the main contractor. So setting out on your own, it was about as stable as it could have been, and it was quite lucky. And then within a few years, I've kind of established myself as a name in the industry. I'd hope a good name, but I'll let other people judge that. And then since 2011, I've just done training exclusively for my own clients as GMH Planning. And generally, our sort of pre-COVID, our order book was sort of 2 months in advance, booked up just with repeat clients. So we don't advertise our training; it's just repeat clients and people, word of mouth and the website. So yeah, and I must admit, sort of 12 years on or 14 years on now, you'd think, well, everyone will know the contract, but people still need advice. They still need a little bit of support, a little bit of guidance, just to understand what is meant to be a straightforward contract, how you can practically, manage it. So, yeah, it's one of those kind of sliding door moments. If that person hadn't given that wrong advice and I hadn't complained about it, we probably wouldn't be on this podcast, or the topic would be something different. Yeah, so that's my background.
No, that's fantastic. And like I say, it sounds like you're a bit of a disruptor and you're in good company. Val and I like that. So continue disrupting where you can. So I think it was about maybe 5 years ago, I was part of one of the training sessions you gave. And if those listening to this haven't been trained yet in NEC, I'd recommend looking at Glenn's training. And I know Val's also been part of it, and we thoroughly enjoyed that. So thanks for that, Glenn. I guess let's get straight into it. So first up, what is NEC Engineering and Construction Contract?
Well, I mean, obviously NEC is a brand name now. So the NEC is a family of contracts, and within the family of contracts, there are a number of different contracts. The most common one is the one you mentioned, which is the engineering and construction contract. And that's used basically between a client and a contractor for any sort of general construction building type work. So a lot of the topics we'll talk about today, we're probably based it on the ECC, the most common one. But then we've also got the professional service contracts. So that's where a client's engaging with a consultant to do design or consultancy. So that is a slightly different form of contract with mainly the rules are the same, but it's just the entities change. So the ECC is between the client and the contractor. The PSC is between the client and the consultant. You've also then got short contracts, so where it's fairly straightforward work. There's a simpler version. So most of the contracts have a short version where it's low risk, straightforward. We've also got things like term service contracts, where it's more maintenance type work. So if you're maintaining an existing facility for 4 years, the contractor's then going to be doing checking, inspecting, cleaning, replacing bits of kit. So you're maintaining the existing quality rather than installing new. There's also things like supply contracts. So if a contractor's purchasing materials, they can use the supply contract to, rather than just have a purchase order with that supplier, to have a bit more rigor with that supplier and also make sure that if they might be late in delivery, there's actually a consequence to them. So there's a contract for that. And now we're in this kind of transition where we've got NEC4 now. So NEC4, which is actually 3 years old, but a lot of clients are slow to switch over. There's a couple of extra contracts in there now, which won't be widely used, but it was a small area that the industry that wanted to see them. So now with NEC4, we've now got an Allowance contract, which is a single contract where multiple parties sign up to one agreement. And also we've got what they call a design, build and operate contract, which is kind of self-explanatory. You design it, you build it, and then you run it for a fixed period of time. So quite often people tell me, oh, I'm working on an NEC contract. So my next question is, well, which one? Because there's a number of them, and then but all of them have a lot of commonality in terms of process, certainly in terms of language. What they're about is common to all of them.
No, and absolutely, and that was quite a nice comprehensive overview, and gave us a good background and foundation for the discussion. But before we get into some of the details of NEC, why in your opinion is NEC a better form of contract compared to some of the others out there?
And certainly as a contract, well, I think for either party, but certainly as a contractor, NEC, the family of contracts are fairer. They're more straightforward, easy to understand. 3 of the key virtues that the authors of the contract put in place was they were trying to come up with a contract to create flexibility, clarity, and very importantly, to be a stimulus to good management. So all of the clauses, the processes are built around those particular elements. So we've already heard a little bit about the flexibility. You've got a number of different contracts to cover the different situations within the contract. So for example, if you take the ECC contract, you can have a lump sum fixed price contract, or you can have a target cost or a cost reimbursable type contract. So there's options. So if it's ECC, you've got options A, B, C, D, E, and F. And then there's further options with secondary options where, again, the client can further tailor that contract to meet their requirements. But probably the main way is the language that NEC have used. So there's no Latin, there's no legal speak within these contracts. They're meant to be fairly straightforward, easy to read and understand. And they're very much around sort of process. So it's a whole series of good practice project management tools that they've then instilled within the contracts. Topic for us, obviously, kind of come up today is about program. So NEC, more than any other form of contract I've ever worked with, elevates the importance of the program. So it obligates that there is a regular revision of the program and then a formal acceptance by the client. So the project manager is the client's representative. So, and there's a requirement for that regularly to be accepted during the life of the project, where other forms of contract like JCT and things like that, it's nowhere near as clear as when there is a requirement for that revised program, and very importantly, its contractual status. A lot of the processes within the contract is stuff that probably we should be doing anyway, but it just formalizes it. Another simple one is the early warning process. So early warnings, very simple mechanism. Here's a potential problem. Let's raise it. Let's get it on the table so we can talk about it, and let's see if we can't do something about it. Let's not focus on whose liability, whose fault it is. Let's just look at the issue, see what we can do about it, and then how we can potentially do something about it to minimize. You probably can't avoid it altogether, but at least minimize the effect. So that's another key feature. And probably the last obvious one that springs to mind is the fact that in our industry, slightly annoyingly, we have a lot of change on our projects. And NEC at least attempts to put rules in place to make sure that change is managed as you go, not just wait for that traditional bun fight at the end of the project, where there's a very twisted few individuals that love that phase of a job. They're called QSs, some of them. So at the end of the job, they love to, let's get stuck in. Here's our claim. Here's our EOT, our prolongation claim. And NEC is trying to avoid that by putting systems in place so both parties know where they stand. So much better place to be.
Yeah, and I was actually going to go down that route of the acronyms as well, because obviously a lot of the listeners will be like maybe new to contracts and just interested in NEC. And NEC is quite prevalent in the UK, but obviously down in Australia, it's not quite as well known. And so, and we'll get into the detail as to why, I guess why. But one of the questions I have is one of the popular contract types in Australia, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, is the PPP, which is kind of a public-private partnership with government for long-term contracts and asset management of a project, if you like. I'm curious as to why they've adopted that, and they usually do that because it's some form of an alliance. And you mentioned in NEC4 there's an alliance type contract setup. What are the I guess the benefits of that, and how, if you've worked with PPPs before?
Not specifically, not firsthand myself, but obviously aware of them, and certainly internationally, a lot of international countries still use FIDIC, and people say, well, why are we using FIDIC rather than NEC? I think the biggest reason is we're creatures of habit. We just use kind of what we're used to, and change is scary. I think for some countries, NEC is too fair. Some clients don't like that. They like to rule with an iron bar, or and it's just like, basically, well, do what I say, and I'll pay you how much I'll pay you at the end, and that's it. So there's an element of that. But I think, certainly, if you compare it to sort of FIDIC, people aren't used to change, and it's just a bit scary. Having said that, Australia now, I think the water sector certainly has, there's been a big resurgence now. There's billions of pounds in the water sector.
I was about to say that. Yeah, I think water is probably the first utility, at least, to try something different. I guess we have to across the board, and it would be a slow, like you said, I think we're creatures of habit, and we're just used to having certain arrangements and partnering with private companies. But these alliances seem to have an impact, and for big projects now, and Australia's got a lot of them, a lot of mega projects. Is there a type of size of project that NEC is designed for? As you mentioned, there's probably different types of contracts within the contract family, but how do they go about fitting the right size for the right size of project in terms of contract?
Yeah, I don't think there is really a wrong size, because if you just look in the UK, you've got like the Crossrail and HS2. Just take those as two projects. Obviously, individual stations on Crossrail, you're sort of circa 200, 300, 400 million. Some of them easily. So big projects, yep. And when you've got smaller schemes, we've got what they call the engineering construction short contract. So if it's a simple, low risk, not too much change envisaged, then you can go right down to use the short contract. And even within the full engineering construction contract, we've got these options, and the options are mainly about how well defined the scheme is, and where you want the risk to sit, and where you want to sit in terms of cost certainty. So if a client goes, for example, Crossrail, they were all option C target cost contracts, because they weren't so well defined. They want to encourage collaboration. So with option C, a target cost contract, if basically in simple terms for users who aren't so clear, you set a target competitively at tender stage, and then if the contractor comes under the target, we share the underspend with agreed split as stated at tender stage, and if they go over, we share the pain. But equally, the client said, no, I want more cost certainty, so I want to go a lump sum fixed price. Well, they could have done, but that would have obviously been a lot more expensive at tender stage, and the contractor may well come way under and make a lot of money, or they might have allowed a risk and not enough, and then they're in trouble. Or where it's not very well defined at all, the client reluctantly goes down the cost reimbursable route, so the option E's, which you don't want to do that on a big project, because you've got budgets, and literally if you're going to pay them cost plus, you could easily spiral out of control. You've got a choice of contracts, and then with each contract you've got a choice of option, which significantly alters the risk profile. So with your projects there, all I can assume is that generally people want to go alliancing where it's really barely defined at all, and they just want everyone to work together, and everyone's paid out the same pot of money. So they've really got to sort of pull together, and if one party's not doing so well, the others have got to sort of rally round. So I think the different types of contract have their place in a given situation, but certainly now with the alliance as well, if people really want alliancing, there's not a massive uptake in the UK. The Highways Agency, we're looking at some alliance projects, and like the design, build and operate, like petrochem industry, build us a power station and run it for 10 years. I think they're fairly niche, those particular contracts.
Yeah, and you mentioned the options. So under the kind of engineering construction contract family, what are the kind of standard options, and what are the most popular you see in terms of training?
Without going into massive detail, because obviously we could, but so A and B are lump sum fixed price contracts, and the difference, A is based on what we call an activity schedule, B is based on a bill of quantities. So the main difference there is the client generates the bill of quantities, the contractor generates the activity schedule, so whoever created it takes the risk in errors in it. But if you lump them together, A and B are both sort of lump sum contracts, C and D are target cost contracts, and then E and F are our cost plus cost reimbursable. And if I bracket them together, I'd say probably very roughly 50%. No, actually, I'd say it's probably a split. So 45% are either A and B or C and D. So 45% are A and B, and probably of that, you've probably got 35-40% are option A, only 5 to 10% are option B. So there's less bill of quantity options. So 45% A and B, 45% C and D, and then probably 10% option E, and barely anything F. Not much uses the management contract. But yeah, it's a kind of split between lump sum and target is probably the most common ones that we see used.
Thanks, Glenn. You mentioned contractor and employer, but there's also the project manager. Those are the three kind of main roles under NEC. I wonder if you might want to just spend some time explaining what the different types of roles are and how they're involved.
Yeah, so again, every contract, I guess, has its own sort of terminology. And we're in this little transition as well, because the fact we've now gone to NEC4, they've changed. So what used to be called the employer under NEC3 now becomes the client. So on today's podcast, I'll probably mention both names, but it's the same entity. It's just NEC4 now calls them the client, and it's literally just a name change, same thing. So the client or employer will appoint, under the engineering construction contract, they'll appoint a project manager to act on their behalf. So the project manager is the person making all the decisions under the contract. So any instructions they need giving, any acceptances, acceptance of program, acceptance of CE quotes, that will all be done by the project manager. And also NEC4, the professional services contract, now has someone called the service manager. So under the PSC now, there's an equivalent project manager role. Before they were called the employer's agent, but now they're called the service manager. So the client will appoint someone. So it's either the project manager or the service manager. And there's also another role in the ECC called the supervisor. So they're also on the client side. They're there to check basically for defects and get involved with tests and inspections. So they're the sort of three entities, if you like, on the client side. And then on the other side would be the contractor for the ECC contract or the consultant for the professional services contract. So they're the specific names. But the project manager under the ECC is really the key person, because they're the ones empowered to give instructions on the client's behalf and, as we say, to accept programs, accept design. And then whatever team they have under them is their choice. They can delegate certain responsibilities to other people. So if they delegate their power in writing and say, well, so if you're named, Dale, as the project manager and you want to give some power to Val, I'd be very careful what power you do give Val. But so if you want to delegate, say, acceptance of programs to Val, then as long as you tell me in writing you've done that, I can now take instruction or acceptance from Val as much as I can you. But you'd have to communicate that to me in writing. So, but yeah, very important person.
I think you mentioned previously as well about the importance of the program, the accepted program, what that actually means in terms of NEC.
Yeah, and it's probably the biggest thing that I liked about when I first got involved with NEC. Previously, it was like ICE conditions or, come across JCT and contracts like that, or the sort of green book. I did some work in sort of the petrochem industry and such like. So seeing NEC, at least there was a real attempt there to elevate program to what I consider to be its rightful importance. It's got its own chapter. So section 3 of the contract is time program. And there's people will be familiar with clause 31.2, which is a big list of items that need to be in the program. So it's almost like a shopping list as to what needs to be shown in a program. We've then got acceptance criteria in clause 31.3. So the project manager has got 4 reasons they can reject a contractor's program. So very specific. And it obligates them to respond to that program. And also in contract data, the client would have stated how often they want to see a program issued on that contract. So in contract data, it would state every 4 weeks or every month. Most typically, there is an obligation for the contractor to submit that revised program, and there's an obligation for the project manager within 2 weeks to respond to that program with either the words accepted or not accepted. And then also on revised programs, there's a further bullet point list, clause 32.1, that says on revised programs, you also have to show this stuff as well as everything in clause 31.2. So for the first time in a contract, you actually had a contract making an attempt to make sure that good practice is being adhered to in terms of what the program should show, the quality, the type of things that should be on there, and a formal recognition that we want it regularly revised and confirming that once that's accepted, it supersedes the previous one. So in effect becomes the new contract program.
There's some things that you can't sort of quite explain just with voice. Some visuals are required. And I specifically remember your training, Glenn. It sticks with me till today with some of the ways you assess, the program and as it moves. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But I just wanted to ask, those that are listening that are planners or project managers and understand float. One of the big questions I think you mentioned before we record is that, people often ask who owns the float under NEC and what happens with it. I know we get different types of float.
There's obviously a variety of different NEC training courses I do. And I think the one you and Val attended a few years ago now was what we call the NEC program workshop. So we can spend all day talking about program, never mind an hour's podcast. We can spend all day looking at these things. So one of the aspects we look at in that session is the different types of float, because the answer to when people ask me who owns float in a contractors program, the answer is it depends which float we're talking about. Because first of all, we've got what you listeners would know as total float. So total float, obviously you've got critical path activities, and when you logic link all the other activities, it by default creates the critical path. And there's an interesting thing on its own. I've heard people tell me your critical path is wrong on a program. It's like, well, how can it be wrong? If it's the right logic, it might not be what you thought it might be, but have a look at it and see if is there an error, or is it just something you weren't expecting? Because if it's logic linked correctly, it is the right critical path. But by creating a critical path, you then have other items that are non-critical, and the total float is how much those items can slip without affecting the critical path. Now, interestingly, under NEC, that float is actually shared. So if a contractor's got 4 weeks float on an item and they're delayed by a week, there may be some direct cost to pick up in that delay, but in terms of time, there'll be no effect on the program because there's still 3 weeks float left. So compensation events are allowed to eat into that total float. So that is shared. Either party can use it. Some people say whoever gets there first. Now, technically, that's the correct answer, but I don't want to promote a race to see who can use it the quickest. I prefer to address it as shared, as who can use it the quickest. So that's the first one. That's total float. We've then got this very specific phraseology that NEC uses, which is time risk allowances. So in simple terms, this is risk the contractors allowed against their own activities to demonstrate they've thought about it and that the program is more realistic. And NEC obligates that you show the client what that is. So we can have a whole debate about how you show it, but that's more than we can cover today. So if you just show time risk allowance, and the simplest way I've found is just show a text column literally. And if you've got a 10-day duration and you report there's 1 day time risk allowance included in that, well, that's it in its simplest form. So you could do it in 9 days, but you've allowed 10. So the intent of NEC is that you're demonstrating to your clients that there is a bit of float that we built in. It's ours, you can't take that one. So contractor owns their own time risk allowances, but it is an obligation to show it on the program. And the main reason for it is to give the client evidence or more confidence that that program is more likely to be achieved. If a contractor's saying we got no time risk allowance built in, well, there's not much hope on them finishing on time. So that's the second type of float. And the last one is one called terminal float. So one of the 2 key milestones we'll touch on today is we've got plan completion and completion date. So completion is a defined term under the contract. We don't have those phrases like practical completion or substantial completion. And what the heck do they ever mean anyway in those other contracts, because they were never defined. Plan completion is when the contractor plans to finish, and you compare that to the completion date, which is the date they have to finish. Otherwise, they'll be liable for delay damages. And if planned is earlier than the completion date, happy days, and that early gap is what we call terminal float. And interestingly, the contractor owns that one. So if they've happened to have spent money or just risk didn't happen and they're now planning to finish earlier, that terminal float's created is theirs. And if they created a 2-week gap, 2-week terminal float between plan completion and completion date, if ever there was a compensation event and now moves plan by 2 weeks, completion date should still move by 2 weeks. So the client can't eat into that terminal float, but they can eat into total float if it exists. So if a contractor's properly logic link their program, the float is what it is, and the rules should be fairly simple, therefore, to follow. So that's my edited version. I don't know how...
That was pretty good. I think we just go back around and just explain early warnings and compensation events, just really your short version of that, because you did mention them there, and it would be interesting because they do line up to what you were talking about.
Yeah, so early warnings are where a contractor thinks there might be a problem. So we've heard we might not get access in 3 weeks' time, and if we don't, that will cause us a big problem. We suspect that the material you specified isn't what meets new European standards, so you might need to change that. So anything you see as a potential problem, we think there might be some asbestos in that building because there's some clues now that we didn't have before. So you raise the issue, get it on the table, and then we decide what we're going to do about it, what we can do about it, and manage it through to a conclusion. So early warnings are potential issues, a chance to sit down and see, well, what can we do about it? Compensation events are things that are already a problem and were not the contractor's risk under the contract. So the obvious ones, contractors experience unforeseen ground conditions they couldn't have allowed for. They didn't get access by the date stated, or design was accepted late by the client. So clause 60.1 is a whole list. There's 21 reasons in the ECC contract in NEC4 as things the contractor can claim as an extra, in inverted commas. And so compensation events are those elements that they can claim time. Time is important as well, and cost. People remember cost, but they forget the time bit. So compensation events is that process, and compensation events themselves have got this mini process within this sort of global process. Because if I'm your contractor and you guys are the client, first of all, I've got to convince you it is one. So I've got to notify and say why I think something is a compensation event. If you agree it is, you'll ask me for a quote, and then I'll give you a quote. And it might surprise listeners to hear that occasionally a client might not agree with the contractor's quotation. Well, Dale, I don't know if that's ever happened to you guys ever.
No.
Never.
Hypothetical situation. So if they don't accept the contractor's first quote, which often they don't, then we go through what we call the assessment phase, which is either the contractor's asked to have another go, or the project manager can say, well, actually, we're going to assess that ourselves. And then finally, they become implemented, agreed. So compensation events, quite obviously complex potentially, and we're no doubt going to these in more detail today. But yeah, that's the sort of overview of basically assessing change that wasn't the contractor's risk under the contract. And that assessment of change, very importantly for us, does need to consider time.
No, that's a brilliant, really succinct explanation. It just draws me to some experience that Dale and I had on a rail project. And something that I really liked about NEC was the fact that it was all documented. So this communication isn't just something that's happening on email or by spreadsheets. There's an actual transaction format, and it kind of makes it a little bit easier. Obviously, there's administration and some of these quotes and compensation vets get technical and complex, but still, I'd rather have it in a system that you can track, monitor, and engage. And it does kind of help with incentivizing good project management practices, which is kind of by design, which is really good. Thanks for that, Glenn. Dale?
Yeah, thanks, Val. Glenn, I wonder if I may just drop in some really detailed questions just for the sake of some of the listeners that might know NEC intimately. And I've got 4 questions that a very good friend of mine, Brendan Robinson, is a senior commercial manager, has sent in. And he's been using NEC kind of for the past 3 or 4 years. And it's scenario-based, which makes it interesting, I guess, for those listening in, and gives us a bit of, I guess, getting a bit geeky with NEC. I would maybe phrase this section. So the first question, and it's a bit long-winded, but I'll try and get through it. And I wonder if you could give us your take on it at the end. So the assessment of a compensation event, prospective versus retrospective analysis. So he says, my experience and what seems to be a common occurrence is where quotation submission for compensation event is delayed and an extension or multiple extensions issued by the contractor have been agreed to by the project manager. This is generally for particularly difficult work. This could be a relatively large sum, a particularly risky event, etc. 1, 2, or 3 extensions have been given, and you could easily find yourself in a position where the actual works could be substantially progressed on site. I've seen cases where the works have been finished for months and a quotation has not been accepted or even provided. The NEC3 suite is clear with compensation events being assessed at around the time they occur or are instructed, based on the forecasted impact of the event. Do you have any advice for striking a balance, resisting the urge to look at actual cost, which is moving away from the risk-based approach of a target-based contract adjustment, as an example? It seems to me that PMs are often compliant with this, almost by habit, where the ease of having actuals to look at is a safer option than the difficulty of an accurate quotation based on a prospective forecast.
Until the actuals are more expensive than the quote, and all of a sudden they're very happy with the quote.
Exactly.
Okay, quite a detailed question there. And so my short answer to that question is follow the contract. And the longer version is looking at some of the elements that can help that process. And the biggest problem we got here is that people don't follow. And when I say people, I mean both parties here. So I think both parties are at fault with what's described, because okay, we understand that there might be some very complex CE, so you might need an extension. But at the end of the day, the contract is very clear. An NEC 4 wording is even stronger than 3, but it's still the same for 3. Compensation events are meant to be based on forecast, not actual. And actually what that does is protect the client as well. Because if you've got a contractor who, let's take a small event, not a big one. So if a contractor says, well, here's our quote, and they say, no, that's far too expensive, have another go, and they go away and they come back, well, here's our quote. And they said, no, that still looks too much. And in the meantime, they've done the work. And the contractor then says, well, we've done the work now. And you can see it took us 10 days with 10 operatives to do that work. Here's our signing in sheets. You can check with security. That was how long it took. So if you're not going to agree our quote, you've got to pay us actual. But the contract, Clause 63.1, says it should be based on a forecast at the point the instruction was given. So if this is a compensation event where there were additional works instructed, this will only ever be based on a forecast. So it protects the client, because if the client now thinks, well, actually, do you know what? You dragged this out. How on earth has this taken 10 days? Because every other time you've done this activity for us, it's only taken 5 days, and you've never had 10 people before. I believe you didn't have anywhere else for those guys. You just stuck them on this CE. So you can't even fit 10 people in that area. You can only fit 7. So those other 3 people you didn't need, and they couldn't have even fit. So I don't know why you had 10 people. So in that scenario, the contract still says the project manager can base it on a reasonable forecast, and that will be on outputs that they think should have been achievable for that particular event. And if their forecast is that should have only taken 5 days, and based on outputs, they can't just say, oh, I think it should be 5. So if they've got a bit of evidence that, well, every other place you've done this, you've achieved 20 meters a day. And if you're saying it took 10 days, that was only 10 meters a day. There's no different situation. So therefore, I'm paying you 5 days. Do you know what? I'll call it 6 for a bit of risk. And I'm only paying you for 10 operatives because that's all that can fit in that area. So in that regard, it's fair on the client that actually it shouldn't just be based on actual. It should be based on a forecast. And one other area that isn't used very well is these things called project manager assumptions. And a lot of time quotes are either big or lots of repeat quotes, because the contractor's saying, well, there's this area here, we don't know what it's going to be, so we're going to chuck loads of risk at it. And so the quote doesn't get agreed. And whereas if it was, for example, I don't know, let's say they're excavating, they're putting in a new pipeline and they don't know what the ground's going to be. Well, in the absence of any ground information, they're going to price a lot of risk. Whereas if the project manager used what we call a project manager's assumption, anyone really sad wants the clause number, it's 61.6. And the project manager's assumption is the project manager saying, well, no, we believe the ground is going to be good in that area. So assume when you dig down to invert level, it's good solid clay. So you don't have to allow for over digging, bringing in material, compacting it. So project manager's assumptions is a better way of maybe ring fencing that quotation. Okay. So the quote should actually be based on a predict forecast, not actuals. And also the positives there is it does mean that if a contractor priced risk that didn't happen for the same reason, they can still claim for that. Because if it was a reasonable forecast to have allowed for some risk, equally the client say, no, that risk didn't happen, therefore I'm taking it out. So the contractor should be paid that risk because they managed it well, even though it didn't happen. It's just time that causes. So the problem is, the longer this goes on, the more chance people want to use hindsight, even though the contract doesn't say that you can. The only thing I think it is useful for is to give a vague sense of, well, was that a reasonable quote in the first place? Because if the quote was 100 grand and it's only cost 10, well, clearly you can use the actuals to say, well, hang on, you allowed for this risk and that risk. That was never going to be a big risk anyway. So other than maybe do a little sense check, actuals should not come into it anyway, because that is not what the contract says.
Okay, brilliant. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but that sounds okay if you sort of, lump sum. What if you cost reimbursable or target cost with pain share, gain share? And in terms of actual costs coming in at the end and they're grossly over, yes, there's pain, but isn't there an argument that says, well, the contractor will add profit to that cost anyway?
Yeah, it's a target cost contract. So if we take that one first of all, so that they will be paid on a target cost contract. They are paid on an actual cost basis, but with a fixed target running in the background. So if they put a quote in for £100,000, if that quotation is agreed and accepted and implemented, then the target will go up by £100,000. So let's say it was £1 million target originally at tender stage. The target's now 1.1 million.
Yep.
But just the compensation events, just like their general works, they will be paid on an actual cost basis. So if the CE the compensation event works only cost them 80,000, well, the target went up by 100,000. They only actually spent 80,000, so that's all they can claim. So now they've got another 20,000 that will go into the commonly known as the gain share pot. So that will be shared. And if it costs them more than they thought, 120,000, the target went up by 100, but they will get paid the 120,000 as long as it's not a disallowed cost, and there's not many of those. So as long as they don't fulfill a disallowed cost, they will be paid whatever cost they've actually incurred. So it still works the same, apart from the target goes up by the implemented CE amount, and they are paid actual cost. And if it's more or less, that will come out in the pain share, gain share. The different one is if we take option E, a cost reimbursable, compensation events are only there as a forecast for the client, nothing more, nothing less. So if a contractor says, well, this extra works, we think it'd be 80 grand. If it ends up being 60 or 100, that's what they're paid. And that 80 grand was only really the forecast for the client's budget because they're paid actual cost. The only important one actually is about program. Because if a contractor, they need to make sure they include the program effects in there because they need to get the completion date moved if it's a critical delay, because they can still be charged delay damages on a cost reimbursable contract. So the main purpose of compensation events for a cost reimbursable contract is mainly time rather than cost, because they're only ever paid actual cost anyway. And again, as long as they don't do something that fits a definition of a disallowed cost, they will be paid everything that they spent.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Glenn. Let's get straight into question number 2 then. So the late submission or lack of submission of periodic program for acceptance. What remedies are available to the PM? Program is often referred to as the lifeblood of the NEC, yet in my experience, especially on higher value and complex projects, the contractors do not submit a program for acceptance in a timely periodic manner. Without an accepted program, which is within the last period, or let's be kind and say a couple of periods, the contract cannot be administered as intended. I've often found this difficult when working with my project controls and programming colleagues when assessing a compensation event, and specifically a quotation for a CE. It is my view that contractors make a conscious decision to do this, especially if the parties' relationship is a little bit strained or the project is going a little Pete-tong. It puts the project manager on the back foot as they are forced to try and follow the last accepted program and update this program into an as-built style, one which can be used to assess time or cost in relation to the CE or quotation. I'm aware of the sanction found in clause 50.3, which allows the PM to withhold 1/4 of the price of work done to date, but this is only for the first accepted program. My question relates more to a project which has a 10 to 12 accepted program scenario, and then suddenly 4 or 5 months where no program has been submitted or accepted. So his question after that background is any tips or experience on this would be immensely valuable.
Okay, first thing to say, just to make it clear, things going a little Pete-tong is not an NEC phrase, defined term, but I get the gist of it. It's gone not very well.
Yes.
So I got the gist of that. Okay, well, first of all, it's a very uneducated, ill-advised contractor who thinks it's in their interest not to submit a revised program, because this is my golden rule for any contractor in particular, any project, but any contractor specifically needs to have an accepted program every period, because you have to assess change against the last accepted program. And as soon as you go more than one period without an accepted program, you're opening up the project manager. Within clause 64.1, it allows them to make their own assessment of any compensation event as soon as you've got more than one period without you issuing a program or they've rejected your latest program. Dale, what do you reckon? If a project manager on the client side is going to assess a compensation event, in your experience, do they assess them higher or lower than the contractor would want?
I'll let Val go. This is a difficult one.
Lower.
That was probably the easiest question of the day. So therefore,
Did I pass?
if they're going to assess it lower and they implement it lower, the only remedy a contractor's got is adjudication. So
You're right.
the contractor want to do that, and luckily, in my experience, isn't that is common. It is common that you go several periods without an accepted program, and I always say that's both parties' problem. A lot of clients say, "Oh, they're rubbish. It's just rubbish what they're submitting." But you need to get around the table with them and explain what's rubbish and why it is important that you should want an accepted program as a client. So you do get clients who think it's in their interest to reject rather than sort of get them around the table. So whoever wrote those questions, yeah, they're correct in as much as the project manager has a sanction on the first program where they can withhold 25%. But once they've accepted the first program, there's no further financial remedy they've got. But the ultimate remedy is that they can assess compensations themselves, which a contractor does not want to happen because they're only going to assess them lower. And at that point, they've only got adjudication to then try and overturn that decision. Really there, I would recommend I always say to project managers, look, if the contractor's not following the CE process, if they're late submitting quotes or they're not getting the programs accepted, well, then make a point of making your own assessment of some compensation events. So when the contractor doesn't like it, if they don't want that to happen again, they'll have to make sure they're following the rules within the contract. It is a common occurrence, unfortunately, on several projects where, for whatever reason, the client will blame the contractor will blame the client, where we don't have accepted programs, but both parties have got to understand why it's so important. I've written articles on this, why it's so important you don't let that happen. And if it is happening, then whoever you are, whether you're client or contractor, you need to get the other party around the table and say, right, how do we make this not happen? This is in neither party's interests for this to be happening. So what can we do?
It's just like an escalation and a de-escalation kind of process. We've heard it called various things, but commercial refresh is the buzzword that I remember hearing when this kind of thing happened. And you generally had a non-accepted program for 5-6 months in a row. More than anything, it perturbs the project teams that just want to get on with the work. So it's not productive when that does happen and you're in that cyclic behavior. But that's good advice there, Glenn. Thanks.
And you mentioned your links to articles and things, Glenn, and we'll get that in the script of the podcast when we issue that. I'm sure people will find a lot of value in that as well. So just 2 more questions from my good friend Brendan. I promise there won't be 2. So question number 3: the correction of a project manager's assumption seems like a relatively simple thing to do, but in my experience often ends up in uncomfortable and difficult conversations. This could be because the assumption itself was poor, but I'm more interested in the decision to implement a PM's assumption, which is a valid / correct and even negotiated in a collaborative way with both parties in agreement. My question is, what would you describe as best proactively to try and avoid a somewhat inevitable situation which the NEC creates when a contractor banks the target adjustment which is provided on the basis of a PM's assumption? Do you have any tips for the administration of a correction to a PM's assumption?
I don't know what kind of... NEC is all about open, honest trust. I don't know what kind of projects Brenda's working on, where they're banking target adjustment. I've no doubt that that this has been experienced, but this isn't what NEC is about or encouraging. And when we say banks the target adjustment, look, let's remind ourselves what a project manager assumption is. It's where, if the project manager doesn't give an assumption, a contractor's got no choice but to price even worse risk, and the quote will be overinflated, and the client won't be happy with it. But then how do they move it forward? So the idea of a project manager's assumption, like I've said, you dig in a pipeline, assume this type of ground at invert level. And if it's not that, well, if it's worse, then you can claim the difference. But everything else about the CE is agreed. And all we're going to do is revisit. So if half the trench was good solid clay, but the second half turned out to be poorer ground, then all you revisit with the project manager's assumption is, well, how much extra bad ground was there and what was a reasonable forecast for that? So we had to overdig by 500 mil. That was for 100 linear meters. Here's the cost of the material. Here's the time it took. This is the machines we had. It should be relatively straightforward to be able to agree the difference in the assumption of what actually happened. So I don't really see why it should necessarily be uncomfortable, difficult conversations, unless the assumption was vague, but then it should be very clear. So it's quite a powerful tool, and it is one that is underutilized, and certainly something that wasn't in NEC 4 that I wish it was, and I'll be pushing for it in NEC 5, is I would recommend basically contractors suggesting assumptions for the PM to agree. Because as it stands, if a contractor puts an assumption in a quote, that can't be revisited. However, I strongly recommend that contractors do recommend assumptions to the PM during the quotation phase. And if the PM agrees them and plays them back and says, yes, I accept that assumption, and that now is a project manager's assumption, well, then it's very clear. So I think proactively, contractors could suggest some assumptions and say, if we don't get the agreement of these assumptions, well, we're going to price the risk instead.
No, thanks, Glenn. And I guess there's nothing wrong instead of having to wait for NEC 5 with people writing that into Z clauses today, is there?
No, there isn't. And that's one I would recommend. And in fact, well, pre-COVID, we due to have our conference in June. So off our LinkedIn group, our NEC People LinkedIn group, we run an annual conference. I can't remember if you guys have ever come to that. So we had to cancel. It's going to be our 10th birthday this year. So we've had to defer that to next June. And one of the breakout sessions was we were going to agree or come up with, everyone was going to feed into it, a new list of NEC 4A Z clauses, so that these are ones we recommend whilst you wait for NEC 5 that you include, and that's definitely on the list.
Brilliant. And just quickly, a Z clause for those that aren't familiar?
So a Z clause is a very rare occurrence in our industry where a client occasionally changes the rules of the contract. But I'm tongue in cheek there. So very often clients, not all, but a Z clause is a change to the standard wording of the contract. So they can be either additional clauses or they could be amendments to existing. So, for example, compensation events, if they delete a couple of the reasons you can claim a compensation event under 60.1, whichever bits they've deleted, then is your risk under the contract. So if they delete number 12, which is unforeseen physical conditions, it then means all risk in the ground is yours as the contractor. So with the Z clause, it can change the risk profile. So yeah, in the meantime, if we think there's some good ideas that they should have put in NEC 4, and we're asking for them to put in NEC 5, we could recommend that here's a list of Z clauses that are good ones, rather than some of the the clauses that some clients currently tend to write and include within the industry.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. And fourth and final question, what is your advice for avoiding the need for a settlement agreement, which rebaselines the contract as a deed of variation? NEC has been referred to as never-ending claims. Often projects reach an impasse. 200 implemented compensation events, 75 of these are agreed. The other 80 are based on project managers' assessments. As an example, the contractor feels aggrieved, but has not pressed the button for an adjudication or challenge the individual PMAs, which they did not agree with. The project is not going well. So just to repeat the question, what is your advice for avoiding the need for a settlement agreement which rebaselines the contract as a deed of variation?
Follow the contract in the first place.
Simple.
So, all of this comes about, this, luckily, again, this isn't the norm by any means, but yes, we're all aware. You guys will be aware as well. Certain projects, fairly famous ones in London currently, where things aren't followed along the way, and periodically they've just said, right, let's those last year of compensation events we couldn't agree, let's do a deed of agreement, let's call that a big number. Oh no, but what they say is, right, let's wrap all those up into one CE, we'll agree that separately, but then we go forward and agree everything else as we should do, so we don't get this mess again. But then another year goes by and they repeat that process. So this is not NEC, and it is not the norm. And a settlement agreement is not something that the NEC allows, but legally, if that's where you are, that's what some projects, I emphasize some, very few, some projects have had to do because they've gotten in a mess and there's no other way around it. So this is not common and not the norm. So the simple thing is, do not let that happen in the first place.
Yeah, and it's a preventative treatment, isn't it? But retrospective, I guess there's not really treatments once the contract, or at least the culture, allows you to deviate from what the contract stipulates. It's very difficult then to unpick it. What can they do specifically? Is there anything they can do? Obviously, they follow the contract is the most important thing, but what if they're past that point now and like they said, they're in a stuck state?
Well, I mean, to be honest, these deeds of agreement or whatever, if they said, look, hang on, yeah, we haven't done what we should have done, so all they can do at that point is do a line in the sand. And the line in the sand is like, let's agree a revised program going forward and get that accepted. Now, very importantly, by accepting a program, they're not accepting liability as to, if they're running late, planned is beyond completion date. Accepting the program doesn't accept that liability. Separately, you then review compensation events to then see if there's any movement in the completion date, which will then take it level with planned, and we assess that separately. But at least you can manage the rest of the job in line with that new accepted program. So further change you can actually look at, but then behind the scenes, you've then got to agree all of these unagreed compensation events, and that potentially then becomes very painful, very drawn out, and the exact thing that NEC was trying to avoid in the first place.
No, that's good insight as well. I mean, yeah, we wish them well. I'm going to switch gears a bit into methodologies and approaches, and one that's close to Dale and I is earned value and its coexistence, I guess, or its palatability with NEC. How can two methods, one contract, and obviously earned value is a contract type itself if you come from defense, how can earned value, which has been kind of mandated by the client or the project manager, as well as NEC coexist?
Yeah, this is a very emotive topic, and you get planners and project controls people. I've never quite figured the difference between someone who's a planner and a project controls, because there's so much overlap, but I broadly get the sort of difference. And when I'm running training, and I can normally tell, if I've not done introductions, I can normally tell who my project control people are in the room, because when I make the statement that, when a contractor submits a revised program, if that program is then accepted, that in effect becomes the new baseline. And at that point, they start hyperventilating. And I normally have to give them a brown paper bag. They say, but you can't re-baseline. We're not allowed to. And then we have normally about a half-hour debate on how these things work. I understand earned value. Let me start by saying I'm not the biggest fan of it. But that doesn't mean I'm anti-earned value. I get it. But my biggest issue with earned value is that it's a tool, but it's not the be-all and end-all tool that some clients like to think it is. In simple terms, hang on, how can you, manage your CPI and SPI when every month you're resetting it, it goes back to 1? So I get that. But all you need is then, in effect, 2 baselines. Now, that does come with its own problems. But if you accept that the rules of NEC are that you assess change against the last accepted program, which in effect is the new contract baseline, so we can manage change against the last accepted, which hopefully will be every period, and then we can run a separate baseline to manage earned value. Because we can't just reset it every month and then think that's changed. But the problem I do have with earned value is that in our industry, there's a lot of change. And I think earned value works very well in the manufacturing industry. And the simple principle of earned value is that let's compare where we are now to where we originally said, and let's see how we're doing. And the CPI and SPI, so is our output more or less than we thought? Is our spend more or less than we thought? So a very good tool. But in our industry, because things change so much, let's face it, the original Contractors program didn't have everything in it that it should have done. We've now changed the order, the sequence. So if you change your logic, you're now moving a cash-rich item either earlier or later in the program, and now your CPI or SPI goes a bit screwy, and you're reporting against it. But my thing is that as long as there's a reason the CPI and SPI has changed, and it's like, yeah, okay, that's the reason it's changed, we've got a handle on it, then it's fine. But some people then want, oh no, you've got to get back to 1. It's like, well, actually we haven't, and we don't need to, but we know why it's changed. The only problem you then get is that if we accept that there's 2 baselines, so we have our last accepted program under NEC rules, and then for managing earned value, assess against the original baseline. But the problem is you've got to change that original earned value baseline, because if you've got compensation events, at some point you've got to add them in. But then when do you add them in? You can't add them in until they're implemented. And if they're taking ages to get agreed, again, you'll be reporting higher spend and that they're not in there. And also, there's a lot of work to then maintain that earned value baseline. And then you can get misreporting because people are so worried about SPI and CPI being wrong, they actually manipulate the program to actually meet CPI reporting rather than actually the program showing the reality, which NEC is the key driver. So that's the slight conflict I have. So let me summarize that. I'm not anti-earned value. I get it. And as a practical tool, I quite like it, but it's a lot of work for arguably potentially lesser benefit. And you are having to manage 2 baselines, which then becomes very tricky. Very difficult when you can change the program. What rules do we set in terms of changing that baseline? And I can remember one project where I was working on London Underground, and for 6 months, the client was hounding me every month. Your earned value is rubbish. It's changing. And it got so different. There were reasons for it. After 6 months, after giving me 6 months worth of grief, they then said, okay, we now agree you can reset your earned value baseline, which on one hand was like, oh, hallelujah, thank goodness we can get back on track now. But on the other hand, it was like, hang on, you give me all this grief for 6 months and now you agree it's so different, we've got no choice but to change it.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's my problem with it. And now you guys are going to tell me why you love it and why it's there's no problem. And I'm making all these issues up.
Surprisingly, Glenn, I actually do agree with you. I think there's a place for earned value, but I don't think it coexists very well with NEC, and it does add a hell of a lot of administration. So if you ask what project controls and planners do on an NEC and any EV contract, an NEC contract with EV rules, that's what we do. We try and bridge the gap. And one of the issues is what you mentioned there was the baseline, or the PMB, the performance measurement baseline, versus the accepted program baseline. I remember just sitting within reviews trying to explain the difference between, and everyone's just glazing over because only project controls people get excited about these kinds of things, and everyone else goes, what the hell are you talking about? And we had pressures from both the client and our own internal teams on what we should be doing with it. And then you've got the administration compensation events, which can only be put into the program once they're accepted. And then you have a backlog, which doesn't reconcile the total values. So the total contract values or the target cost values don't reconcile. And so you've got these delta logs that are backlogs that your team's responsible for filling in. And the third part, I think, is around the fact that earned value is base state. It's a fixed dollar. So it's usually contract award that, you keep a de-escalated rate so that the performance measure isn't skewed by indexes or inflation or any types of indice changes. Then they ask for, then you think compensation events, well, they're usually quoted in current day dollars. So then the finance team want you to re-escalate or do some magic with the numbers to get them back up to current day dollars. So you end up producing multivariable charts for the same information. And you have to ask, what's the point? Is anyone actually looking at this? And quite rightly, people start factoring their forecasts to make one or the other look good. And it just drives the wrong behavior. I think it doesn't help the situation. So I haven't seen to date, and maybe someone listening to the pod can prove us wrong. Love to hear your feedback where you've seen an earned value kind of ruled or earned value mandated program with an NEC contract working beautifully. I would love to see that and hear that. But yeah, I tend to side with you on this, Glenn, is that it's a wonderful tool when it's used right. But under the prospect of NEC, it seems to that it's lost its way and it causes more problems.
I was just going to add there, Val, that I agree with both what you and Glenn are saying. Yes, I am an advocate of EVM, but I think Glenn mentioned something important, only if it's appropriate, right? And I think something important to point out that even though you, in terms of NEC, when you accept your last accepted program, and in terms of NEC, that's called the new baseline. That doesn't mean re-baseline in EVM terms, right? So we just got to get that straight. We're not going to go into EVM on this pod, but it's important that I think people asking you those types of questions, Glenn, need to understand what EVM gives them in the first instance. I agree with those sentiments, strangely, but yeah, it is important to distinguish between the two. So yeah, Val, I don't know if you have any last questions for Glenn before we wrap up.
No, I mean, in the absence of, I guess just to close on that point around earned value, I mean, in the absence of not having earned value, what works well with NEC in terms of performance measurement?
I'm a bit old school. Just a regular accepted program showing reality is brilliant. As I say, we had a discussion recently on the LinkedIn group, and I just wrote down another quote that someone else said, where they said, again, agreeing with the issues of it. Two comments were awful lot of work for little benefit, can encourage wrong behaviours. The one I sort of picked on was being on or ahead of the curve becomes more important than reporting the reality. So yeah, I think for me, it's just about making sure your revised program is reflecting reality. We're keeping on top of assessing change, and that in effect is the measures you really need. So where are we in relation to completion date? Are we ahead or behind? We can look at our spend profile. Is that roughly where we thought we should be? And that will, just give you a better, more accurate picture and much more sort of proactive way of trying to see where you are on the program. The concept of EVM is great in a more controlled environment. And, where are we in relation to what we thought we'd be in terms of productivity and cost? Obviously, that's definitely a measure, but not to the extent that some clients, because they don't apply logic, they just apply very hard and fast rules that just don't work in our construction industry, unfortunately.
Yeah, well said, mate.
Brilliant. Thanks, Glenn. In terms of summing it up, I usually try and sum up, my top 3 highlights of the pod, but there's just so much in here. And I think, we're going to have to go back and listen to it over and over just to get all the gems and the nuggets that you provided us today, Glenn. But what I want to encourage people to do is check out yourself and your consultancy, GMH Planning. Get onto LinkedIn, get in touch with Glenn. If you haven't had training yet, I'd strongly recommend using Glenn for any training. And also to mention that the LinkedIn group is NEC People on LinkedIn. So get in touch there. Glenn, are there any final words that you want to leave us with?
I think there's just one little topic which I can sum up in a minute that we've not covered, and that's just assessing change. We have talked about how compensation events are this kind of rigid process of notification, quote, assess and implement. But one issue we have, particularly with NEC3, is how you assess change against the last accepted program, particularly when the last accepted program was, in Brendan's case, several months old. It's only his project; it never happens anywhere else. So if you've got this 6 months without an accepted program, NEC4 has now finally got clear language in there in terms of how you assess that change against the last accepted program. And importantly, it says if your last accepted program is 6 months old, if a new compensation event lands today, you take the last accepted program, but first bring it up to date with all the other Cs you know have happened and progress. See where you were after all that before you then assess this new compensation event. So that's much clearer rules now on how you assess change, which we didn't have before. And the last one that users might like, finally in NEC4, we also now have a deemed acceptance of the program if they don't respond.
Oh, wow.
So where the contractor didn't if they put in a program, no response after 2 weeks, yes, under NEC3, they can notify that as a CE, but you couldn't put cost against it and they were still left without an accepted program. So now NEC4 says, if you're going to be that silly, you've got to remind them, first of all. You remind them, and then a week later, that program, if there's still silence, does now become deemed accepted. Two nice features now, finally, with NEC4 to encourage that good practice project management.
Brilliant. Thanks, Glenn. Val, any final thoughts, words from you?
No, that was fantastic. Thanks, Glenn. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge. Fantastic.
That's good. It's good fun. Glad to have a chat with you guys.
No, brilliant. Thanks, Glenn. So, folks, that's all we have time for on this episode, but the fun doesn't have to stop there. Subscribe via our website and receive a link to our online community where you can chat directly to Val, myself, our expert guests, and other community members. For more information, blogs, and previous podcasts, check out projectchatterpodcast.com. A massive, massive thank you to Glenn Hyde for spending some time with us today. Thanks, as always, to Val, and thank you all for listening. Till next time, be safe, stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. Bye for now. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast belong solely to the participating individuals and not necessarily to the individual's employer, organization, committee, or other group or individual. Additionally, any views or opinions are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or individual.